So everybody, thank you so much for your patience while we work through some technical difficulties. I want to take a moment and thank you for joining us for our, September meeting. I can't believe it's already September. We meet every second Thursday of the month, and we really ask for everyone to share about our meetings, spread the word, because we want people to take advantage of this virtual format. What's kind of cool is that people can join from really anywhere, which is pretty awesome. And then just to, let's see, we want to do a special thanks to our Zoom sponsor, which is Davis Cards and Games, and Melissa Showalter. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think joined us at our last meeting, and she graciously sponsored us for our $15 Zoom fee. And so if you, is Melissa on? Oh, good. Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much.
You said it right, Showalter.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, glad to be a part of the group.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate it. And definitely check them out online, see what kinds of games that they have. I've been bugging Melissa about a Bob Ross Monopoly game, that sounds really cool. So
I even have bee games. Anytime I see a game with bees in it, I'm like, I have to have that.
Oh my gosh. So, Melissa, please post in our private group when you get those in, because that would be awesome. So,
I will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So just a little bit of updates about our group. We are still looking for a new location, and that means, we really do need everyone's help. We're looking for maybe someone who has a local church meeting room, maybe the Veterans Hall, something along those lines. If you already belong to maybe some of these lodges, please reach out, let them know that we can absolutely do social distancing. And what our plan is we'd like to be able to have, we'd like to be able to do small group meetings where we can socially distance, but we can still project and do a virtual meeting at the same time, because we have quite a few members who want to get together in person if they can wear a mask or maybe socially distance, and that kind of helps us fulfill both needs. So if you are a member of a lodge or a church or anything that could have a meeting room that we could use once a month for 3 hours, that would be fantastic. So keep us in mind. So tonight, this is our September meeting. We usually do, well, this is only our second September meeting, but last year we did the most awesome thing. We actually had a honey tasting. So with that in mind, knowing that we couldn't necessarily get together to actually do another honey tasting, we were put in touch with Mark Carlson, and he currently works as an R&D chemist for a small private lab. He is interested in honey tasting services, or testing services, especially pollen analysis. He actually is a graduate as well from the 2016, which was the inaugural class for the California Master Beekeepers. He keeps his own Italian, Carniolan and Buckfast honey bees in his Bayview district of San Francisco. And he says that his bees love the local fennel and blackberry flowers, and he loves their amber honey as a result. But we are super excited because he is involved in a lot of bee-related outreach activities, which include teaching beekeeping classes, writing blog articles, and he collaborates on various honey-related committees, including the Good Food Awards. So he is going to walk us through all the different flavors and things and considerations that have to do with honey. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and allow Mark to introduce himself as well, and then share his screen. And I'm going to make sure that he can, want to make sure that he has permission to do that. There we go. All right, Mark, it's all yours. We're so happy to have you here.
Great. Thanks, Cherie. How's my audio? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can hear you great.
And how's the screen sharing?
Oh, yay, we can see your screen.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put that up into a slideshow. How's that look? You good?
It looks great. And just
awesome.
So everybody knows, if you have questions during the presentation, go ahead and type them in the group chat. And then probably about halfway through, I'll check in with Mark. We'll see if there's any questions that he can answer at that time, and then we'll do some more Q&A at the end.
That sounds great. Thanks, Cherie, for the invitation and introduction. And you got it. I am very excited to be doing lots of honey tasting, but also my work in the lab allows me to do work with the quality assurance. So some additional criteria in addition to that, which we do with our mouth and our nose. And so I titled this talk just the quality assurance of honey, and I'll go ahead and get in. So as we all know, it does take a lot of bees to make the honey, and foragers, which are a little bit older in the colony, they're going out to flowers and they're collecting nectar from flowers and bringing it back to the colony. And in general, it takes a lot of miles. They have to fly because their stomachs are not very big and because nectar also has lots of water. And when they bring it back to the hive, they pass it on to nurse bees who are a little bit younger, but then they will pass it around themselves and they regurgitate it out of their honey stomach through a process of trophallaxis. And then they'll eventually, I think of it like they chew on it a little bit and then they eventually hang it in, or they put it into one of their cells, and they'll continue to dry it by fanning their wings. And this is a process that'll go on until the honey, or until that nectar is about 18% moisture. And then at that point they cap it. And I'm sure that a lot of you are all familiar with that story. And the next part of the story, which is we beekeepers then dive in and we borrow the comb for a bit, and we cut it or squeeze it or spin it and filter it out and enjoy it. And so that's just a quick, I'm a big fan of behavior. And so this talk is a little bit more about chemistry, but I do really love talking about the different bees and what they're doing and the different triggers that they go between their different chores in the hive. So a fun story in biology and behavior too. And so, as you mentioned, there is a lot of interesting work going on with honey flavors. And just so we're all on the same page, honey flavors, the unique flavors of honey, are specifically originating from the plants that they're collecting the nectar from. And so nectar drives the flavor of honey. And in addition to that specific type of plant, which might be the biggest criteria, then that honey is also, the flavors will depend on the specific soil conditions, the health of the plant, the temperature, and also pollen will always get into the honey as well. And that's an interesting story, but again, based on what the plants can provide. And so I have a couple different honey jars on the screen there. And I think of course, the dark as the buckwheat is a pretty known dark honey and really nice, rich, dark flavor. And then I harvest some honey that looks kind of like that jar labeled with a D. I harvested that last year, and it was quick to naturally crystallize and a light amber in color. And that was from a fennel flower, which I think predominantly from a fennel flower, which I have in the upper corner of my screen. Hope you guys can see that bee. And then my other primary nectar source is blackberry, which you see on the other side of my screen. And I end up tasting a lot of different honeys from all around the United States too. And so I get pretty familiar with the different regions and the different flowers and the different honeys that they have. And so going forward, as Cherie, as you mentioned, y'all have done a little bit of honey tasting in your own. And I have my own method in doing it, and I'll be facilitating a honey competition later this month where each judge will get a real brief training. And I think you might have already heard some of this before, so I'll just go through it real quick. That I always like to hold the honey, if it's in a small cup, I'll hold it in my hand so that the cup will actually warm up a little bit. And so by warming the honey, you release a few more of the aromatics, the volatile compounds. And so warming and smelling is a great way to get started before you actually stir and taste. And once it's in your tongue, it's good to let it melt. And then breathing in through your mouth and out through your nose will engage more of your nasal cavity and get more of those smells. And so you get a lot more of the fullness. And then let's see, I have one thing I wanted to bring up here that a lady named Barbara Boyd wrote this in an article in 2011, and she emphasizes how it's good to rest a moment after you've put it in your mouth and swallowed and let it slowly go down your throat. And as she said, you can even take another taste in between, but by giving it a little bit of time, I think of that as getting it past the sweetness that's on the tip of your tongue and moving back into the sours and the bitters and savory. I almost think of once I get it really deep into my mouth, I'll even get some of the butteries and the savory flavors. And I really like to emphasize those. If you're looking for different honey flavors, you know you're going on a flavor hunt when you really get that deep into the profile. And then I just mentioned a few references here. Amina Harris is out of UC Davis, and Marina Marchese is in the East Coast, and she has a American Hunting Tasty Society. And then this Barbara Boyd, who's written up in the Bee Culture magazine. And that said, I'm glad that you guys have an introduction to tasting already, and I'll move forward away from flavors and actually get into a little bit more of what quality analysis might look like for honey. And that's just to give an introduction to folks so they can be aware of it, but also be trying to improve the quality if they are ever considering for sale or even for competition or for your own volition. So there are organizations in California that are regulating the quality of honey, and they use different criteria. And I've listed them here on the screen. The cottage food operation is an important one. If anybody, I suppose, Sheree, you have a handful of folks that are already bottling and selling their honey, and so they're quite familiar with all those steps already. And in addition to that, the California Food and Agriculture does regulate the labels of jars and some of the defects of jars. And so if anybody is serious about it, they would want to familiarize themselves at least with the organization and then also with some of those details. The Department of Pesticide Regulation regulates the different chemicals, and that's critically important as it relates to contamination from different treatments that you might be putting in your bee hives and wanting not to have them affect your honey quality. Of course, the USDA, Federal Department of Agriculture, is responsible for some things with honey as well, and those are related to the grades of different honey and the different colors of honey. And then the US Food and Drug Administration is responsible for as other foods. And so pretty familiar with, and if you guys haven't looked into those, worth keeping the links and being aware of those different departments. And then from those organizations, from the government regulatory end of things, I then branch off into what do food competitions look for? What are the guidelines that people have traditionally looked at for submitting honey into a food competition as just a rubric, as a criteria base for what we could consider higher and lower quality honey? And what I found really interesting, I picked up this book, I'll reference it later, and it was written 1994, and I thought it was really interesting. They found that flavor wasn't as important of a criteria when you are submitting to your local county fair, and that they describe it because judges have such different palates, and you might not have judges agree so easily. And I think that's an important cornerstone of what flavor profiles and judging honey is all about too. And so some of these other aspects aren't looking for high quality, they're looking for defects, they're looking for problems. And those are some that I'm sure your club has heard, and Sheree, you've probably gone through yourself, and that as you're bottling your honey or as you're collecting your honey, if you do it in a way that you're just learning and you might have, I don't know, for example, overheating while you're trying to get the honey out of the wax, or I find myself during filtration, I can get a lot of air bubbles still in the wax, and the methods by which you filter, you can have a lot higher purity that you can even see. And so the layers on the top of the honey is really important when people are submitting to different bee competitions for their honey, the surface layer of the honey, and whether or not it has these particulates or also the bubbles, the micro bubbles that might result from fermentation. And then of course, moisture content. I mentioned that early on, and I'm sure most of your folks are familiar that honey is defined by that 18% moisture. And so if you do have a product that's slightly higher, if it's 20% or 25%, you might quickly, someone who's evaluating the quality assurance of quality of honey might identify that as a criteria by which they would be flagging it as a problem. And then historically, then there's been some work with polarized light, which I found interesting again in this book by Roger and Mary Lou Morse. And so if folks are interested, it's an easy read on Amazon for a couple bucks, and I enjoyed going into it. And one area that I'll branch off from here is just this idea of crystals. And I found this interesting that traditional honey evaluation would identify crystallization as a potential defect. And most of us are aware that honey will naturally crystallize as a result of a solution having a supersaturated, having such a high concentration, an abnormally high concentration of sugars, that it doesn't take much for those sugars to start to turn into a solid. And once they turn into a solid, they can either precipitate out or they'll stick to the edges of your jar. And so a lot of us, if we're familiar with crystallized honey, it cuts more like butter rather than pours like liquid, but is a naturally occurring process. And so our honey competition with the Good Food Awards is it uses different categories. We call something called liquid and naturally crystallized honey. And so those are interesting things. And the texture that crystals can bring is another interesting aspect of honey criteria. And just a little bit deeper into honey crystals, like I said, or Sheree, you mentioned, I do work in a chemistry lab, and I am interested in what properties do catalyze the formation of crystals. And so a lot of it has to do with the purity of your honey, but also the materials by which those crystals can form. And so if they can form on what's called a seed, or a surface that permits that crystal to start to grow and then propagate further, a lot of those effects are interesting to observe. And maybe the type of jar that you're using could have a higher rate of crystallization than another type of jar, or the type of material that you're using. And so those are all interesting as folks get more involved into the specifics. And maybe after a couple years of harvest, you notice that a different vintage, a different crop might have a different crystallization pattern too. So I'm gonna assume that I'm a little bit behind on our start, and so I'm going pretty quick, but if that could be just a real quick introduction. And I don't suppose folks have started, I don't have a chat screen open, but if anybody has any quick starting questions, I'm happy to cover them, or just kind of keep on breezing right through it and save it till the end. So I'll pass that over to Sheree if you want to give a quick shout out for questions.
Yes. Let's see, and I'm going to put a little reminder in here too. Let's see. So one question might be, so what's interesting is that we here in the Central Valley, it's been crazy hot this summer, right? It's been above 95 for like 2 months. And a lot of people do harvest their honey in August and September, usually in the month of August, maybe the beginning of September. So when you talk about heating, we're so fortunate because here it's still pretty warm out. It's warm, so people can create hot spaces easily to harvest their honey. But because of all the smoke, I'm wondering if the smoke, is it possible to taint the honey with all of the smoke that we have right now from the fires?
Really interesting question. And in San Francisco right now, if folks are looking at the air quality across the state, we are as bad as we've been this year. Today is a pretty dismal day in the Bay Area for air quality. And not only do we acknowledge that there's these small particulates, the 2.5 micron, but we're seeing a rain of ash on our cars. And I think of how those flowers that the bees might be visiting are also getting rained on by ash. And as those bees land on those flowers, and they themselves might be getting ash on their bodies and transporting this solid material back into the hive. I think for sure there is a naturally occurring ash in honey, but nothing like when we would have such a high concentration that's covering the bee's body. And certainly it would get stuck in all of those little honey cells. And bees are exceptional at cleaning themselves off, but when you have such a high concentration of ash coming down from the sky, I would be very surprised if it didn't have an effect. And my next half of the presentation will be a little bit more at the analytical chemistry on how one might actually quantify that concentration. And as you said, maybe you have smoke, and that'll affect how your bees are behaving. Maybe you'd know that the cloudy days, the bees are not foraging as much, and so enough days of not foraging could affect your honey sources as well. And they might miss a bloom because they're staying in their hive rather than going out to forage. And so not only is the atmosphere and the smoke a big impact, but I think the ash, and especially that solid particulate that's coming down from the sky, that's going to land on the bees, that's going to land on the flowers, it's going to be part of it'll be mixed in with the pollen that gets into the hive. And so a really tough riddle. And then whether or not one who tastes something funny in their honey after a harvest during a year like this, would they want to go through the extra steps to determine it? And not that I am recommending it to folks, but at least to let everyone know that those options are available. Should someone be that interested in going to a laboratory to find out whether or not their honey has a higher concentration of ash, those are, if they have a guess at what, it's tricky to know what that ash that's falling out of the sky is actually made out of. I think, of course, the carbon that trees are burning, but if it's a potassium carbonate versus a different type of carbonate, or different molecules, plastics or other bad chemicals or compounds that might be burnt in the process also getting up into the atmosphere. All of those can be individually detected if you know which one you're looking for.
Would it affect the honey's pH at all?
Yeah, great question. And typically ash would be a way to which you would raise it alkaline. You would be increasing the alkalinity of your honey. And I think most of us are probably aware that honey has a natural acidity to it. And so would that affect the taste and the flavor? I think so. But would it also affect the pH of honey? And it's interesting because how much is in there would be directly related to how much it affects it. Good question.
Good deal. Thank you. I think that's all we have so far.
Great. And so going forward, quick review though, we just had where that flavor is derived from, and that flavor is not the only way to evaluate, and that traditional competition was focused on impurities. And so what I'm finding in modern competitions are looking a little bit more at flavor profiles, but also some of these new technologies that are able to identify, especially if there has been any adulteration. And that might be for a broader international crowd, but I'll go into some of those details here next. So the example for a modern quality guideline that I chose was a conference that just occurred in Montreal last year, and an international conference that had a honey competition, and they had some additional criteria that they were considering to be, if your honeys weren't going to pass these criteria, then they wouldn't be eligible for the awards that they were allocating. And so in addition to the one that we of course are familiar with, this moisture content of 18%, but then they went further to look at the different types of sugars that are in the honey and the ratio of these different types of sugars. And that's important if you're adding artificial sweetener. If you wanted to increase the volume of your honey by adding a corn syrup or even just cane sugar, that has a higher concentration of sucrose. And so if you're identifying a higher concentration of a different type of sugar molecule, then that can be a good indication of whether or not your honey has been adulterated. And that's been more interesting. That's been a higher area of focus for those that are interested in quality assurance of honey. Further, in kind of those that might have any background or familiarity with chemistry, this idea of isotopes, it's a unique way by which chemists are able to identify a ratio of a typical atom, like a carbon atom, versus a special carbon atom that has a slightly different composition. And that ratio is very specific. And we can tell whether or not a sugar, for example, has come from a type of plant called a C3 or a C4 plant based on this carbon isotope ratio. And so that's a complicated procedure, but academics are looking into it. And I find it kind of an interesting use of the technology, although fairly expensive and not necessarily appropriate for a backyard beekeeper, an interesting process nonetheless. And then most new competitions are also concerned that folks are over-filtration. They're providing too much filtering of their honey, and thus they're taking out the pollen and a lot of these other compounds that might, and granted, if you're filtering at 4.5 micron, you might have macromolecules of enzymes and other things that are very valuable for our human consumption. But it's interesting to think that if you're removing those, you, in my opinion, are decreasing the quality of honey. And so folks are going into honey and looking at whether or not they have these, especially the pollen is an easy one, that a pollen would be caught by that ultrafiltration process. I use just a cheesecloth, and I suppose you and a lot of your other club members just use a cheesecloth. That's a pretty easy way to clean out the honey sufficient for calling it still pure and not too filtered. Overheating, as you mentioned, that's a great one if you can use your 90-degree outdoor temperature, or at least something that isn't providing too much direct heat, so you're not having to cook or pasteurize your honey, and that'll modify the enzymes, as I'm sure folks are familiar with. But then how the different organizations are looking for that quality, they're identifying different compounds in the honey that would have been modified if that honey was applied, it did have too much heat to it. And so those are criteria that are important. And again, they require some specialized equipment. And actually I see here too that the pH does change as a result of overheating. I'm not quite sure which direction it goes, but interesting to know that that would be a criteria. Ash could kind of also do the same thing, but in a different process. And so again, overheating is something that folks that are doing quality assurance are looking for. and then antibiotics and pesticides as they could be either applied both to the hive or to the environment around the bees. And so folks are using chromatography in order to identify whether or not any of those specific pesticide compounds are exactly present. So that said about Apimundia. The other quality guideline that I'll mention is an organization that I work for, or that I volunteer for, the Good Food Awards, and they have an interesting criteria that is a little bit more about beekeeping practices, and they're interested as an organization to promote sustainability, and they want to encourage beekeepers to be doing as much for the benefit of bee husbandry, but also for, I like that they're promoting that beekeepers who are submitting samples for this competition should be, and I think we all should be, following the guidelines for different chemical treatments that we're putting in our hive to avoid that to have any potential impact on the quality of our honey. Other pretty standard criteria that if you want to submit a honey, you have to be the beekeeper, you have to own the bees that are creating that honey. That seems pretty logical. And again, right there at the top of my list here, I say that it should be extracted with minimal heat, and then also filtered to keep that pollen still present in the honey. I also like that part of the Good Food Awards is we are promoting community involvement, which, as I'm doing here, and Cherie, if you go through the Master Beekeeper training, you'll see that that's part of our responsibility to that organization. And I like that all beekeeping clubs might have some opportunity for some community outreach, or maybe just getting together is something that you're engaging with each other, and how you're having those be important criteria for just the community of beekeepers as well as the high quality of honey. I think it reflects a good representative of the honey bee community. So that's the Good Food Awards. And then just briefly, there are these methods available in laboratories, and I don't suppose too many backyard beekeepers are really sending their honey for submission because it costs money to do this, and you have to know what you want. But these processes are available in different laboratories, and if folks are interested, they can make inquiries about them. And certainly one area that I've found myself interested in these laboratory analyses is as it relates to volatile aroma profiles, or are there compounds, for example, with fennel. I have to look at my Latin name for the fennel. It's got a funny word that, oh shoot, now I won't remember, that you can actually use it as a detection. You can actually go looking for, oh boy, it's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, there are different compounds that are present in different nectars. And so if you're aware of what they are, you can actually go and find them. You can find them in the different honeys using these different analytical procedures, in addition to specific pesticides and antibiotic contamination. And nuclear magnetic resonance, a very high-end procedure that is rarely used, but also interesting in itself for different procedures, different aspects of honey. And then, like I've mentioned, this pollen analysis. Oh, actually, let's see, the phonicium. Oh no, I can't remember again. This fennel pollen grain is actually on the screen in front of you. And my work with a microscope allows me to actually look into my honey and go looking for these pollen grains. And so if you familiarize yourself with which plants your bees are visiting, and then understand what those pollen grains look like under a microscope, you can then cross-reference that to what pollen is in your honey. And folks will actually make pie charts out of their honey to determine which ratios of nectar they think their bees are visiting. And that's a real fun way to also associate with different flavor profiles. So that's pollen analysis. It's a little bit more complicated than I mentioned, but something that I'm finding particularly interesting, and that is not as analytically involved as some of the other processes I mentioned. And then last year I did think about that wildfire. I had a conversation with some of the other folks in my lab about how they would go looking for ash in honey. And so it's a really interesting question, and I suppose worth discussing further, especially as more people are considering harvesting honey during this season. And then just to kind of wrap things up, there are some basic advice and methods for backyard beekeepers like y'all are in the Big Valley Beekeepers Guild. And so keeping it clean and making sure you're following all those procedures in your honey shed and honey harvesting equipment, and certainly being responsible for food quality is important and will affect your honey quality. Not applying too much heat, avoiding any adulteration with any type of non-honey, pure honey sugars, and because that's what folks are now looking for and concerned about. And chemical treatments, again, making sure you're following all the chemical treatment. If you are applying a miticide, if you're putting mite away quick strips, formic acid into your hive, you're following protocol. They say that the formic acid will have minimal effect on any honey supers that you might have in place. But I think all of those guidelines that are written on the outside of the package are as important as anything to be following if folks are trying to create a higher quality honey. And that all boils down to how are backyard beekeepers able to really evaluate the quality of their honey. And certainly the taste and the visual inspection are easy. And the books, specifically that Roger and Mary Lou Morse book is a great starting point if folks are just wondering how they can consider their honey as other folks would evaluate it. And then I like the idea of a simple tool, a refractometer that you might be able to buy for 20 to 50 bucks online is a simple way that you can be sure that your moisture content is at 18%. And then this idea of pollen analysis and microscopes is something that I'm looking into. And if folks are interested, I'd be happy to take any additional questions on pollen analysis. And that said, those are the different documents and books that I've referenced. And I would like to thank everybody. Sorry, I went kind of fast, but hopefully to give a chance for questions and also get folks on to their evenings as they were previously expecting. So with that, Cherie, again, thanks for everybody's attention, and I'm happy to hang around as long as folks want to with questions.
Thank you. No, that was great. I think we do. We have a couple of questions that have come in while you were talking. So so let's see. So Paul is asking, he says, I use the metal 2-stage sieve. Is that how you pronounce that, sieve? To filter my honey. Am I filtering out any of the good stuff?
Yeah, so those, I'm going to scoot back in my chair. I have a reference chart here beside me, and it has the different microns for the different standard sieve sizes. And I think that number 2 is actually, that's a pretty easy, I think that's a pretty big, they evaluate the sieve based on the pore size. And so I mentioned this ultrafiltration as 0.45 microns. That is tiny, tiny, tiny. And so I think that metal sieve is quite large and not at all, I think you'll still get your pollen through that sieve.
Okay.
Interesting question.
And yes, and actually Brad, along the same line, he's asking if, oh gosh, and I don't know if I'm saying this in the correct way, but will a 200, and it says the letter U?
That's the micron. Yep.
Oh, that's the micron. So you can
micron.
tell that I'm not a chemist. So will that permit pollen to pass? So it sounds like it will.
And was that Paul? Sorry, I didn't catch his name.
Brad. That was Brad.
Brad,
yeah.
Thanks. That's a great question. And it really is, it's one for those that are thinking about small things. And because I'm looking at these pollen grains, I'm thinking about their actual sizes. And 200 micron is, so if you're thinking about a micron that's a pollen grain, they typically do come in less than 200 microns, so they'll be able to fit through that sieve, whereas like a big chunk of wax, I think 200 micron would be a great sieve filter size. And so that would be a great pore size for different filtration, because obviously you wouldn't want to have a whole bunch of wax or a lot of other particulates that you wouldn't want too big of a filter. But I think 200 micron is that's a great reference point.
Great reference point. Okay, good deal. And then we have several people that have some refractometers. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, that's great.
So so when you get those from like Amazon, for instance, it gives you instructions kind of sort of on how to calibrate it. So what's the best way to calibrate something like that? Have you had experience with that?
I have, and so different models are going to have different protocol, but when you do have it up to your eye, there is a pretty, when you have it dialed in, it's basically a line that you'll see that the instrument will give you a line right across a scale bar. And so the top of the bar might be, and the other interesting thing is, depending on your refractometer, you might have various units that you might have to compare with you might have to convert it to get to % moisture. And I'm trying to remember what the typical units in a refractometer are. I don't know if the gentleman or the person who wrote that question can remind me of that, but there is a typical unit that is not
Bricks.
just as simple as percent moisture.
What was that? What was that,
Bricks
Brad?
or bricks.
Right. Yeah. And so this
Oh,
number
yes.
of bricks, and I think can be directly converted to a percent moisture, and if not, to density. And sorry, the person who's speaking, is that something you're familiar with? Is that how you would describe it as well?
Only from reading the instructions that came with my refractometer and calibrating it.
Sure. And then how you might explore as a scientist in a lab. I also don't always trust I don't always give it, I'm pretty critical of any practice. And so if I had honey and I knew it was around 18%, and then I mixed in some water and I then saw that scale change. And so you can do a simple experiment to make sure that your instrument is actually detecting any changes, any treatments that you might be doing to a honey. And so I'm sorry, Brad, I'm not providing a whole lot of useful advice to you, but once you do find yourself on the right track, I would say it wouldn't hurt for you to do your own simple experiment by taking some honey and mixing in a little bit of water, and then possibly getting a confirmation that of the sensitivity of that refractometer. And then at least you would know that in fact it was capable of detecting these changes in moisture, which is what you're really looking for.
Mark, I think sometimes we've read the recommendation to use like an olive oil or a vegetable oil, something along those lines, but that always seems kind of strange. I think it's because we know what the moisture content is of oil.
I don't know. Yeah, good question. But maybe
Yeah,
because the way the device looks, the way that device works, it must be that's a useful solution for the way in which the instrument is measuring. Good feedback.
now we have it. Yeah. And now we have another good question that came in from Matt. He's asked, can you explain hydrogen peroxide in honey?
Sure, a great question. Thanks, Matt. I do a little bit of other work with disinfection of water and how. So hydrogen peroxide is just that it's a molecule that is fairly close to water. It's also, as in it looks a lot like water, and it just has an extra hydrogen, and then also very similar to just oxygen in the gas, in its gaseous form. And so so interesting that hydrogen peroxide is a lot like water. It's a lot like oxygen, which are very safe and normal in our life. But hydrogen peroxide, when you have that specific compound, it's actually quite antibacterial. As most of us probably know, that we have bottles of hydrogen peroxide in our kitchen or in our medicine cabinet, and we use that we used to use that for disinfection. Folks are using it a little less now. But the great reason, thanks again, Brad, or Matt. Thanks again, Matt. So when bees are collecting the honey, they're collecting the nectar from the flowers. The nectar doesn't have, there are certain enzymes that are not present in the nectar. And once the bee consumes that nectar, puts it into their gut, and then regurgitates it out, it has these specific enzymes. And when those enzymes are present in both regurgitated nectar and also in honey, those enzymes create a great, if they're exposed to the atmosphere, then they'll undergo a chemical reaction, which will then generate this hydrogen peroxide. And it's exceptionally valuable for honeybees who want to keep their honey free of bacteria. And so this reaction is very valuable to the preservation of honey that wouldn't necessarily be present in the preservation of nectar. And so the production of hydrogen peroxide as a result of an enzyme that's in the honey as a result of bees' gastrointestinal, their microbiome in their stomach. And so hydrogen peroxide has been measured in various different for different antibacterial purposes. So honey can be used to kill bacteria, and that hydrogen peroxide is pretty often identified as the primary contributor to, when you ask, if you were to ask what's killing the bacteria, if you apply honey to a petri dish that has bacteria in it and it kills the bacteria, one of the primary reactions is the production of this hydrogen peroxide. Maybe some of your club are also familiar with Manuka honey from New Zealand and Australia, and that has a whole nother additional compound that's present in, I think Manuka honey comes from tea trees or some Australian or New Zealand plant. And so that nectar has some inherent antibacterial properties that, in addition to the hydrogen, so the amount of disinfection that occurs with hydrogen peroxide is then amplified, is actually magnified, is increased as a result of these other compounds in Manuka honey. And so researchers who are interested in the antibacterial properties of honey can then isolate which compound is actually primarily responsible for the disinfection of bacteria. But my work with bacteria has got me excited and enjoying thinking about hydrogen peroxide as a great and fairly safe antibacterial in our world of disinfection these days with COVID-19. I think of how different chlorine disinfectants are great at killing bacteria, but they're also have a slight, chlorine itself has a slight possibility for residue or certain not great compatibility with our system. And so how hydrogen peroxide in its natural composition of just oxygen and hydrogen allows it to break down a little bit easier into molecules that we ourselves are regularly exposed to.
Mark, does the use or what we know about with hydrogen peroxide and honey, is this part of the reason why some medical professionals, when they're dealing like with wound care, they'll actually prescribe what looks like bandages of honey?
Yeah, I was teaching in San Francisco probably 3 or 4 years ago, and someone who was working for a medical grade Manuka honey company, she actually sent me a whole bunch of samples, and I really had a great time speaking with her, and I got to see what some of these bandages look like that I don't even know if we could buy them. Maybe you can buy them online, but if they're not prescribed by a doctor, they might be really expensive too. I have no idea how much they cost, but they do have high purity. Manuka is the most favorable medical grade honey out there right now, and so smart in their packaging. They look just like a bandage that you can peel off a layer and then just slap it right on an open wound. And the honey has a great ability, in addition to its acidity, so acidity and osmotic properties. So it is there's so little water that if you submerge a bacteria in honey, it's actually the moisture, the water in that little bacteria gets osmotically pulled out of it. And so it can kill, the honey can kill bacteria in a lot of different ways. It also is acidic, which bacteria don't always like acids, and so, or acidic conditions. And so on top of that, the hydrogen peroxide. And the nice part about wound care is that acidity, but also that desire for honey to draw in moisture allows wounds to not necessarily dry out, or it allows a nice healthy condition of healthy skin recovery that is the right balance of moisture. And how other wound care, I guess, of sometimes when I wrap my finger in a Band-Aid, it might be too moist or something, that I guess there are moisture conditions that aren't always easy for wounds to heal.
See, this to me is just amazing. And I know our main topic was about honey tasting, but but honey is just such an incredible resource, and it's amazing that we're even using it in medical science. We had another question come in. So I don't know if you happen to know this, but Karen would love to know really kind of what's the typical percentage range of H2O2. We have some science buffs in our group. What is that typical percentage in honey? Do we even know?
That's the hydrogen peroxide. And it's a great question, because it might, if you have it capped inside of a honey cell where it's not exposed to air, it might be very low. It might have a very low concentration of hydrogen peroxide. However, once that cap has been opened, that wax cap, or if you open the jar of your honey container, or you spread that honey out on a surface, and its exposure to the air will actually catalyze that reaction. And so the honey itself might have a very low concentration of hydrogen peroxide in its pure sealed off state. But once it does have access to oxygen, then that reaction can occur. And I think the hydrogen peroxide concentration would also increase, which poses a great riddle for a researcher or a chemist who wants to identify that. You'd really have to be particular about what conditions you're defining in order to have your results represent a specific, your results be able to answer a specific question. And so really great question, Karen. I hope I answered that for you.
Yeah, good deal.
And maybe just as a quick qualitative answer, it would be a very small fraction, certainly less than 1%. I think even possibly less than 0.1 or even lower than that.
All right. Well, I'd love to open it up. Is there, if anybody else has any questions, they're welcome. We'll just take, we'll see if anybody wants to unmute themselves and go ahead and ask a question directly. Anybody would like to do that? We'll give them a minute to find out where the mute button is, or I can unmute everybody. Let's see, and I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. Are you on LinkedIn, Mark?
I am, and maybe
Okay.
Sheree, I can just give you all my contact, and anyone who has any questions going forward, maybe I'll just kind of keep on chatting, and any questions, just go ahead and interrupt me or get them on the chat. I'm happy to take everything that folks are interested in. But with regard to LinkedIn, I'm also networking myself somewhat with this California Master Beekeeper Association, this program, and that's we're considering how master gardener programs around the country, they have I guess they call it office hours, where they are trying to make themselves master gardeners, that is, are trying to make themselves available to folks that might have questions, and how our master beekeeping community is really new, like your bee club, and how we're still just pioneering what that might look like. But myself, I did the Peace Corps in El Salvador 2005 to 2007, and that was maybe the start of a general interest in a little bit more community organization and community development, and how I sure appreciate those that are interested and have questions, and I certainly don't mind making myself available, and I'm glad that there are a couple other beekeepers around me that are encouraging that behavior too.
Yes, absolutely. I'm actually one of the 4-H beekeeping project leaders, although with COVID it kind of changed everything, so it made it kind of tough. But
yeah,
we've been involved in 4-H and some other community groups, and but it does. Let's see. I'm looking now. I see. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
sure
It's
is great.
fantastic.
And how to get kids involved there's nothing
Yeah.
like the enthusiasm, and I'm glad you're getting a great turnout from your bee club, but how folks are able to get enthusiasm in science at a young age too, great. I'm glad to hear it.
It makes a big
I am
difference.
too.
And I saw that Melody unmuted herself. Melody, do you have a question by chance?
Well, I was just wondering, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Melody.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just wondering if we should be feeding our bees during the poor quality of the air so that they don't have to forage as much, or would they still go out and forage?
Really a great question. And if you have, Melody, if you've done feeding before, you might remember that sometimes you'll notice that they'll not be drinking. So a new hive, if you set up a nuke, or you set up a new colony, they do like it right at the beginning, and then they kind of wean themselves off. Sometimes they'll stop drinking themselves, and you'll notice a lower consumption rate. Whether or not that would be a great benefit to the hive right now, it's what an interesting challenge we're all facing, and how we don't know the duration of this event. We don't know, is smoke going to last for weeks or months, or is it going to be back again next year? And those lack of being able to predict, I'd say if it was just going to be for a week, your bees would be fine and not necessarily be worried. And actually, we in San Francisco, when we had that bright orange day yesterday, a lot of emails were circulating about interesting behaviors. We weren't sure what the bees were doing because they didn't have the light cues that they normally would have. And so that might be something that if the bees didn't have the right light conditions in order to get out and forage, and that happened over a long enough, I hope that San Francisco is going to be clear in a couple days, because we've had a lot of weeks of cloudy weather or fog, smoky weather. And so I don't know how y'all are doing specifically in the valley, but it could also be that you're going on week number 2 of smoky atmosphere. So I'd say the quick answer is probably not critical, but also interesting to think about how long this goes on. At some point, you have a threshold that you're starting to worry more about your bees not foraging enough. Hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, I noticed there's not a lot of activity around the opening, so that's why I was wondering.
Yeah, and so I'd say again, if we're looking at just a couple days, I think they'd be quite okay with it. But as time goes on, and it also is interesting in how it might relate to your harvest cycle. And if you're done harvesting for the year and you're just trying to make sure they've got a established food source going in, you all don't get really too cold, so you probably don't see clusters. You probably don't see your bees really. And you might even have a nectar bloom in San Francisco. We have a bloom for 12 months out of the year. And so our bees have I'd say they're pretty spoiled. They have pretty good access to food all year round. My mother lives in New York, and she keeps bees as a result of my encouragement in the last couple of years. Maybe pestering. I've got her to have her own hive, but she lives in a place that has 4 months of snow. And my brother in Minnesota, also familiar with beekeeping, and so his concerns about going into the winter season, he doesn't want to have his bees not have sufficient, or she wouldn't want to have her bees have insufficient food sources.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good. And I think we have one more question come into the chat, so maybe we'll do this one and then we'll wrap up. And Matt brought up a good question, which has to do with augmented honey, right, or adulterated honey. And there's even, I think there was something on, I think it was under Rotten, and Netflix did, I think maybe last year or the year before, they did a fantastic I guess series, and one of them included the adulteration of honey and how that works with the world honey market. But what do you feel, Mark, is the biggest problem that you see with augmented honey?
So my guess would be that it's folks that have 10 gallons of honey, and it might be really great stuff that they want to turn into 15 gallons. And without pure honey, what can you pour into that that would be hidden? And as I've mentioned, if any of you are, I wouldn't encourage it, but if any of you are thinking of that as something you might consider doing, as I mentioned, the balance of these sugar molecules is very precise. It's very sensitive. And so when, maybe I'd say, especially in an international market, you might go to your store and be able to pick out one jar of, maybe it would be called California local honey, and maybe at your farmer's market, you'd have 5 jars of local honey. And then at the big grocery store, you might have 2 or 3 jars that you don't know necessarily where they're coming from. And maybe it is from overseas, and China does produce a lot of honey, and their standards might be slightly, well, it's all about who's doing the evaluation. And the company that I work for does look into food adulteration, and how honey might be one of those categories that they would say, has it been modified such that the FDA or those that are regulating importation, which that's really high up in our federal government, at least that wouldn't necessarily, I would think that would be Food and Drug Administration. That'd be federal level, not even just California, because as those foods come in from overseas, then the regulatory agency that would be monitoring them would have to be federal level. And then what they would be looking for would probably be this sugar balance, and that would be related to someone who is just trying to increase their volume. And that might just be with molasses or corn oil, and both of which might not have a huge impact on what we might taste in a grocery store, inexpensive economy honey, not knowing its origin. But again, at a molecular level, it is distinguishable. And so I think those are areas that are going to continue to increase in scrutiny. I think that people will continue to look closer at what these imported products have. And certainly at the Appamundia, this international honey competition, that was a great prediction of where the industry might be going, because they might be pioneering some of their criteria, and it has yet to be, I don't know what Canada is doing specifically or Mexico is doing, but the United States might see that as an opportunity, or years to come, maybe that will eventually be a standard that they want to incorporate into what we're considering honey that we're putting on the shelf in front of a lot of consumers.
Yeah, very good.
Great,
Thank
thanks.
you so much. Before we wrap up, I just want to share my screen really quickly, just so everybody knows, our next meeting is going to be on October 8th, and we actually have Anna Heck from Michigan State University coming on. She's going to be talking all about honeybee pheromones. And she's going to kind of show us how honeybees communicate through their pheromones and how paying attention to these hive scents, like banana and lemon, right? We keep talking about flavors, can make you a better and more effective beekeeper. So watch for our emails and private group Facebook page posts on that too. So
sounds like a lot of fun and a great set of questions and a great group.
Thank you, Mark. We can't thank you enough for being here. It was very interesting hearing a chemist's point of view. And when you definitely send me your contact info, we will share that on the private Facebook page. So if you want to link up with Mark on LinkedIn, and I did look up that book, The Honey Shows, and it's about $15.99 on Amazon. So you guys can get it.
Let me do another. If folks, and regarding flavors, this one is on my reference list too. And I've met Marina. She's a rock star. And so if it sounds like everybody loves talking about honey flavors, it's a really easy and sociable subject. And I'm really looking forward to tasting a lot of honey in the future. And I hope you all are too. And exploring different honeys is it's a great hobby. I think the more you enjoy your own honey, the more you get kind of curious of what else is out there. And there's some fantastic honeys all around the US. So if folks are curious to just kind of start exploring different varietals, I don't think they'll be disappointed.
Very good. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you. All right. Have a great rest of your month and stay cool and I was going to say smoke free, but that doesn't really work right now. But I just hope everybody's safe during this fire season. So, all right. Take care. Thank you so much. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye now.